Hello and welcome back to Ethics and Leadership, where we're going to continue on today in discussing a little bit of identity politics, although actually we're going to rewind a little bit in time to visit the civil rights era and some of the arguments that happened during that period. We're going to do this with Brother Malcolm, Malcolm X. Malcolm X was probably one of the two greatest orators that existed during the 1950s and 1960s. His main competition being, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. The Black American tradition kept oratory alive a lot longer than the white American tradition. And man, did they produce an impressive part of the tradition. As opposed to Martin Luther King Jr., who was born and grew up in the South, Malcolm X was born in the North. He started out in Nebraska and they moved back and forth between Detroit and other places. His father was in fact a Baptist preacher who was in favor of black pride and participated in a movement to get black Americans to move back to Africa so that they would have control over their own situation. These activities got his father plenty of pushback, and as a matter of fact, when Malcolm was a child, their home was burnt down with the family inside. They escaped, but this was clearly a reaction of white supremacists from the area. When his father died when Malcolm was 6, was blamed on a trolley accident, and the insurance company claimed it was an instance of suicide. The family never actually believed that and suspected that, again, the father was killed by white supremacists. After going back and forth with the insurance companies for years and facing economic despair, when Malcolm was 13, his mother had a mental breakdown and was institutionalized. He and his siblings were spread out throughout the child care system. During his childhood, Malcolm went to school and was actually fairly successful. He was incredibly talented intellectually, but he ended up dropping out after one of his teachers informed him that his dream of becoming a lawyer was, quote, not something a nigger could do. So we could summarize, not a great early life, and in large part due to the actions of white supremacists. The movement from that rough childhood to becoming the leader of a mass movement during the civil rights era is an important one, and Malcolm told it himself in his extremely good biography. That story includes a period where Malcolm became, by his own account, a kind of hoodlum, working his way through the streets of taking advantage of people, through to a stint in jail where he was converted into the Nation of Islam, which will come up later. It was actually at that point that Malcolm changed his name from Malcolm Little to Malcolm X, out of recognition of the fact that his original last name was probably taken from a slave-owning family that had owned his ancestors in the past. By changing his last name to an X, Malcolm meant to represent the fact that he had in fact lost his own identity in the process of slavery. Malcolm's life story is incredible and thrilling, and you really ought to at some time check out the movie Malcolm X. That was an excellent portrayal of his life. But again, for our purposes, I'm more interested in the ideas than the life, so while we'll come back by parts of it, for the most part we're going to focus on what Malcolm thought. But before we get to Malcolm's thought, I want to cover a little bit of the ground between Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X in the Civil Rights era, because there were some important arguments that were happening internal to black culture about how blacks should relate to what was generally a white supremacist culture around them, and how they should think about themselves and their own identities. One of the most important occasions for those arguments in black culture occurred between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, both of whom were, in part, the inheritors of Frederick Douglass's reputation and stature across America as an enlightened member of the black community. Booker T. Washington was the more established of the two, and he sought in his own philosophy to find ways for blacks to move ahead in the society without ruffling too many feathers of white supremacists who were around them. So, following on one of Frederick Douglass's themes, he emphasized hard work and advocated that blacks accept capitalism and live into the system as a way of getting themselves ahead. He also famously was a part of accepting the Atlanta Compromise, where during Jim Crow in the South, whites made an agreement with blacks that they would allow them minimal education and basic liberties so long as the blacks didn't challenge the political dominance of whites in the society. It's in the context of these arguments that W.E.B. Du Bois ended up disagreeing with Booker T. Washington about the best way to move ahead for blacks. Du Bois didn't disagree that hard work and industry would be required in order for blacks to get ahead in society, but he believed that that alone would be insufficient. In order to move ahead, blacks, and especially those blacks who had gained the advantages of education, would need to fight against the racial structures that were built into society. So, according to Du Bois, it was actually impossible to just accept the system as it was and think that you could get ahead by putting yourself to work as much as possible. You had to actually become anti-racist in order to bring about significant enough change that it would influence the status of the race. This doesn't mean that Du Bois entirely rejected the picture of modern America. In fact, he thought the future of blacks included embracing parts of contemporary culture, including higher education and developments of modernity. But at the same time, he didn't want to lose what he thought was distinctive to blacks, which he talked about in terms of there being a folk, a particular people with a kind of spirituality that he believed needed to be infused with their acceptance of modern education and intellectual development. This led Du Bois to develop his highly influential theory of double consciousness of those who had in fact accepted parts of modern society that were often identified with whites, and yet who also identified with the black populace and wanted to keep some part of that spirituality, that sense of people that they'd come out of. Like Douglass before him, and in his own way, Booker T. Washington, Du Bois was trying to struggle with the question of to what extent you should be separate as a black person, trying to hold on to your own distinctive identity, and to what extent should you accept elements of the surrounding culture. And he recognized that in that process, the division drove all the way to the core of his own soul. The black man, he said, was forced to make decisions about their own identity that white people never were, because white people could identify themselves wholeheartedly with modernity and the developments of Enlightenment society, while blacks had to figure out how to merge these different identities, on the one hand as a modern person and on the other hand as a distinctively black person, because these could not be assumed to be the same thing from the beginning. And this is a continuing tension that has plagued black intellectual culture and black leadership from the time of Douglass all the way to the present. And it's one of the issues that we see come out again in the arguments and positions of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. So let's look more particularly at how Malcolm X sorted through some of this stuff. In writing his biography, Malcolm X looked back at his early life and was deeply disappointed, not just in himself and his own choices, but the context that he had been given for making particular choices. And he celebrated the kind of transformation that he'd gone through as he moved from that early child and then the person that he describes as a hoodlum on to an educated person who was articulate and could in fact make the incredible speeches that he later did. And in that process, he found incredibly valuable education, even though it didn't come to him as much from the outside as it did through his own application. During his time in prison, Malcolm X actually picked up and decided to copy an entire dictionary in order to be as eloquent as preachers that he had heard elsewhere in the black community. And interestingly, here he actually identifies with a theme that goes back even to the Stoics. The idea that the most horrible of imprisonments might be the imprisonment we experience in our own minds, and that by gaining intellectual power, we could actually gain a form of freedom. So he says in his biography, "As my word base broadened, I could for the first time pick up a book and read it, and now begin to understand what the book was saying. Anyone who has read a great deal can imagine the new world that opened. I never had been so truly free in my life." But this freed him not just because he became more educated, but because he tried to do analysis of the language and the idioms and the forms of the language. And this in part pointed out to him places where the overall ideology of the society tended to be white and white supremacists. So in some ways, Malcolm was actually following along with that tradition that we saw starting back with Wollstonecraft and Douglas in picking up ways that the culture, in fact, influenced our perceptions of race at the most basic levels, even at the level of language itself. Now, as I mentioned, during his time in prison, Malcolm converted to the Nation of Islam, which we ought to say a little bit about, although I can't go into all the fascinating history. The Nation of Islam was a uniquely American black movement. While it picked up imagery and concepts from Islam, it was not a traditional form of Islam at all. As a matter of fact, it embraced its original prophet, a guy named Farad, as a kind of appearance of God in the world. And the prophet who came next, Elijah Muhammad, put himself on an equal level as a kind of prophet, representative of God. And the teachings of the religion reflected a kind of ontological racism, by which I mean an idea that the different races are essentially different. So in contrast to Douglas, who had seen that race was in fact a kind of accident of history, the Nation of Islam pictured race as fundamental to the identities of people and ineradicable. So if you were in fact black, you were from a particular tribe as opposed to people who were white, and that this made significant differences to the kind of person you were because it was built into the race. This theory included the idea that blacks were in fact a superior race to whites, but that whites had taken advantage of blacks and had actually placed blacks under oppression, which was the opposite of the natural order. This occasionally led to the claim that the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X himself were reverse racists or were black racists, and to the extent that believing in the superiority of your own race is simply racism, then yeah, that seems accurate, at least for Malcolm X's early period. But we should distinguish this from another claim, which is that the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X, even during this early period, meant to, in fact, just reverse the system that was in place in America and put blacks in charge. So that then, presumably, blacks would be oppressing whites, or blacks would be in the proper hierarchical position if we were like Aristotelians. But realistically, the outcome of the thought of black supremacy was the idea of a segregated society, a development of black separatism, and ultimately the idea that blacks should return to Africa in order to claim their own control of themselves and build a superior society there. So not exactly the same as white supremacy. So at this point, I'm going to say some things about what I'm going to call Malcolm's early period. I'm not counting his period as a hustler, which some people count as his early period, but I'm going to think about his period when he was linked up with the Nation of Islam as his early period, and then later when he broke with the Nation of Islam as his later period. So there's only two for you to remember. So in his early period, one of the central ideas that he worked with was the idea of brainwashing, that black people had been brainwashed by white society. And here we can hear echoes of Frederick Douglass's claims that blacks had in fact been brutalized by white society, that they had been forced back into the positions of brutes and had taken this on themselves without adequate education and enculturation to teach them otherwise. Malcolm tended to associate this brainwashing with his own earlier activities, his kind of uneducated period in the streets and participation in crime. He saw himself as among those blacks who had been brainwashed to think of themselves as inferior, as criminals, as hoodlums to start out with. And in reaction to this, he embraced and advocated for a new kind of strict moralism in accord with the Nation of Islam principles. It's interesting to note that in some ways, the kind of moralism that was accepted by the Nation of Islam as a reaction to that idea of brainwashing reflected in part the standards of bourgeois middle-class life. For instance, the acceptance of dressing in suits with ties. This was then, in some senses, an acceptance of particular elements of the culture around them and an effort to move ahead by adopting some of the elements of that culture. Of course, it wasn't simply that. I mean, with this, the Nation of Islam did not accept the kind of radical individualism that we've seen expressed by some white theorists like Nozick. Instead, they remained focused on a particular community, and in this case, a particular religious community, which they saw as bringing about a transformation of their lives. And along with this went a strong emphasis on discipline. This is a discipline not provided by white people, but by a hierarchy internal to the organization itself, which went from the common members all the way up to their prophet. Malcolm X quickly climbed up the ladder in that organization and became somewhere around second to Elijah Muhammad himself. Further, with the Nation of Islam, Malcolm in his early period accepted racial separatism as the goal at which he was aiming. He believed that this would allow blacks to take back control of their own lives and that, in some ways, this was the only option for them to gain their own rights, since members of white society showed no interest in giving them those rights themselves. Now, you might think that black separatism seems a lot different from the kind of standards of the United States and the liberal tradition, and you'd be right in that. However, you might want to note that at the same time as Malcolm X is pushing for black separatism, the kind of society he imagines blacks participating in during that separation in many ways reflects America and the liberal tradition itself. So fundamental to Malcolm's preaching is the idea of rights, and basically equal rights. He's not looking for rights for blacks that are over whites. He's thinking that blacks need to segregate themselves in order to create their own society where they might have the same kinds of rights that whites have in their society. Malcolm also drew on some of the fundamental symbols and ideas of American liberal society in order to articulate his vision of black separatism, so suggesting that what blacks needed to do was create their own declaration of independence from white America. And when he talks about revolution and revolutionary black activity to bring about a new black community, he often references the American Revolution as a kind of model for this. So we can see here again the tensions that are going on internal to the system. How in the heck are you going to be a black person and fight for your own rights? Do you accept the culture? Do you reject the culture? How do you deport yourself in this? And we can see some of this tension even in Malcolm's late work. So you read from one of his latest speeches, but it still reflects this. I don't even consider myself an American. If you and I were Americans, there'd be no problem. Those honkies that just got off the boat, they're already Americans. Polacks are already Americans. The Italian refugees are already Americans. Everything that came out of Europe, every blue-eyed thing, is already American. And as long as you and I have been over here, we aren't Americans yet. In this quote, you can see the tension. On the one hand, is he lamenting the fact that he isn't American? What he's saying is, I haven't been given the same rights as all of these people. Even though they showed up later, the fact that they have lighter skin entitles them to American rights. So is the problem that he's been left out of America? Or should we understand this primarily as a criticism of what he called Americanism, just a couple of sentences later in the same speech? At stake here are deep questions about identity and race and how you're supposed to relate to a society in which you have kind of partial membership, but are never allowed to actually come to full participation. And in some ways, this still reflects the question that Frederick Douglass was trying to deal with in figuring out whether he could in fact use or needed to reject those founding documents of the United States, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Another element of tension was Malcolm's approach to economics in his early phase. So again, he was a black separatist, so he believed that blacks needed to separate themselves and be able to provide their own community with their own bases of power. But at the same time, he basically imagined that economy internal to the black community as reflecting the capitalism that was usual inside the United States. So in one sense, he's a radical pushing against the basic structures of society, and in another sense, he's actually accepting those structures and trying to recreate them in his own community. Ultimately, during his early period, and on and off after that, he imagined the ultimate goal to be a true segregation of blacks from whites, a return to Africa where blacks would be able to create their own structures and, due to their inherent superiority, would in fact become not only competitive but superior, not because they oppressed other people, but because they would just get ahead naturally. Now, it's common in talking about Malcolm X to mark a distinction between one period of his life and another at his break with the Nation of Islam. Now, his break, actually, there's multiple reasons that it could have been that he broke away from the Nation of Islam. One was the official reason given by the Nation of Islam, which was that he made a statement after JFK was shot. And he said, well, the chickens have come home to roost. By which he meant that, well, if you live in a violent society, violence is going to get you eventually. Basically the same kind of claim as those who live by the sword will die by the sword. So if you are a participant in a violent white society, you're going to get taken down by it. So officially, Elijah Muhammad found that to be an offensive statement and sidelined Malcolm. But there were several other things going on at the time. So, for instance, Malcolm's growing power inside the Nation of Islam meant that he was becoming a kind of threat to many of the leading members, including possibly Elijah Muhammad himself. And some were talking about whether Malcolm should, in fact, take over. Well, that power struggle internal to the Nation of Islam may also have contributed to the break. Finally, it was about this time that Malcolm discovered that Elijah Muhammad himself had been sleeping around with several of the female members of the Nation of Islam, something that was not acceptable under the strict moral standards that the Nation of Islam was preaching. And Malcolm himself had been outspoken in favor of women's rights at times, advocating for increased education for females and greater equality. So his break might have had to do with the fact that he ended up finding the institution to be morally corrupt. But regardless, what followed was a fundamental breakdown, and the two separated ways. The Nation of Islam held Malcolm afterwards in contempt, and as a matter of fact, he was eventually killed by several members of the nation. But Malcolm decided to take the break for what it was worth. He decided to branch out and try and learn new things. He went to Mecca on the Hajj, which is a ritual pilgrimage required of Muslims in general, and there he discovered that the Nation of Islam was not actually in line with most of Islam. He also experienced a wide variety of different people from different ethnic backgrounds coming together for one religious experience. In one case, he was challenged by a leader from North Africa who, to him, appeared to be white. And this leader said, okay, if your distinction is between white and black, then how are you going to make sense of me? I'm a revolutionary, I am fighting for justice, but you appear to leave me entirely out. These kinds of encounters led Malcolm to reassess some of his beliefs and rethink a great deal of his politics. We can see this in some of his statements about white and black culture later on from his life. So, we are living in an era of revolution, and the revolt of the American Negro is part of the rebellion against oppression and colonialism, which has characterized this era. It is incorrect to classify the revolt of the Negro as simply a racial conflict of black against white, or as a purely American problem. Rather, we are today seeking a global rebellion of oppressed against the oppressor, the exploited against the exploiter. Now, this didn't soften Malcolm's critique of injustices inside the United States or his fundamental belief that the injustices were primarily brought about by white supremacy, which was either endorsed or tacitly accepted by most whites in the United States. But at this point, Malcolm decided to open himself up to the activity of some whites who were in fact arguing and working on behalf of blacks. Now, he's careful to say that this doesn't mean that he thinks he owes them their thanks. He arrived a little bit late to the party for his concern, but he doesn't think that being white necessarily, ontologically, naturally makes you a kind of immoral person or an oppressor. This shift also allows him to reconceive of the rights that he'd been talking about the entire time. At this point, he adds to his account what appears to be basically a natural law basis for rights. And this allows him to draw the distinction between what he calls civil rights and human rights. Civil rights are based in a particular country and its law, but human rights, he says, are based in your identity as a human being. And he starts to think that maybe the best route is actually to push this not to their own segregated society, but on up to levels of international community. So it was that at the end of his life, he toyed with the idea of bringing things up in the United Nations and possibly pressing the case of black Americans that they were being treated fundamentally unjustly in terms of even international law. In his later works, Malcolm also develops a critique of capitalism. As a matter of fact, he would say at times you can't have capitalism without racism. And he would identify capitalists, those people that he called capitalists, with bloodsuckers. He says you can't be a capitalist without being someone who takes advantage of other people. Now, I don't think we should go so far as to suggest that Malcolm became a communist or a socialist or a Marxist towards the end of his life. His critique of capitalism just isn't that developed. But he certainly saw the ways in which the economic system in the United States worked together with other factors to hold people under conditions of oppression. And that's actually something that we've seen when we were talking about institutionalized racism in the last lecture. So, for instance, how it was the case that, despite the fact that nobody in the creation of cameras or film or any of that meant for the cameras to be racist, but in part because they knew their own target demographic, because they had wealth, they created cameras primarily for white people and didn't think so much about what the impact would be on blacks in the society. Now, I've held off for last on one of the elements of Malcolm's thinking that actually he remains fairly consistent about across, which is his justification for violence. And this was one of the elements that led most of white society to contrast Malcolm with Martin Luther King Jr., who of course was an advocate of nonviolent action. And there is no doubt that this and Malcolm X's separatism do distinguish him from Martin Luther King Jr. and were in part at issue when a lot of the back and forth happened between the two, although rarely face to face, usually through their speeches. And even in his latest speeches, while Malcolm X had kind of moderated himself towards saying that violence wasn't the only option, he still pressed that there was or could be justification for black violence internal to the system. So he says, for instance, and now you're facing a situation where the young Negroes coming up, they don't want to hear that turn the other cheek stuff. No. In Jacksonville, those were teenagers. They were throwing Molotov cocktails. Negroes have never done that before, but it shows you there's a new deal coming in. So there's no doubt that Malcolm X did accept that blacks had violence as a potential recourse in the process of seeking for civil rights. And I find it interesting that to this day, much of society kind of villainizes him for attempting to articulate a justification of violence. The reason that I find this somewhat strange is that if you read Malcolm X and his justification for violence, it sounds an awful lot like other justifications for violence that we've found at the very center of not only the liberal tradition, but the American liberal tradition. So let's go back to the basic justification for the American Revolution. Well, you remember that Locke had articulated that there should be no taxation without representation, because everyone had natural rights from the state of nature that they bring with them. And that if the government was going to come and tax you, take away your property, you had to at least have some form of agreement to this. So you had to be represented in the government. In short, in the Lockean liberal tradition, one of the fundamental roles of government is to protect your basic rights. And if the government doesn't do that, then you're justified in fact, rebelling against the government, revolting and fighting against them. This was the basis for the justification of the Revolutionary War of America against England. Well, now look at Malcolm X's justification for violence. It actually turns out we don't have to say much more. He looks at the society and he says, look, here's the deal. The government has the obligation to protect the rights of black people who are citizens in the society. And we participate in politics to try and bring that about. But if it's the case that we cannot gain representation for ourselves through the ballot, through our voting, then it will be the case that we have no more recourse except the bullet to actually rise up in rebellion. Now, unlike many of his own critics, Malcolm X was extremely aware of the fact that in some ways he was parroting exactly an argument from the liberal tradition, and you can find him playing on that in his rhetoric, which is brilliant. So when he says it'll be the ballots or it'll be the bullets, it'll be liberty or it'll be death, he's echoing exactly that sentiment of the founding fathers of the United States. In that last sentence, word for word, he's quoting Patrick Henry. But what worked as an argument for the founding fathers, all of whom were, of course, white landowning men, gets Malcolm X condemned in our society, and in many ways leads to him being portrayed as the evil alternative to Martin Luther King Jr. To really bring this irony all the way home, I want to show you something that I found while I was actually looking for images for this lecture, which is this, the guy right over there, who actually is a member of the Tea Party, which was a conservative organization that pushed for libertarian type policies and voted almost exclusively Republican, the party that's not identified with black rights at all. Now, this guy went out and he set up his sign to argue for those libertarian policies and Republican government, and he decided that he was going to write, "By ballot or bullet, restoration is coming." I highly doubt that he knew that he was actually quoting Malcolm X. And the category of restoration here actually becomes a little bit problematic, because what is he worried that's been lost over time? I mean, here's a white guy protesting and arguing for a restoration of the past. How far back does he want to go? All sorts of questions really about the rhetoric and ideology embodied here, and I'm not going to resolve them for you. Now, Malcolm X wasn't done in the process of kind of revising his own thought and his own philosophy. Many of those ideas which he started developed in this later period that I've talked about never actually get fleshed out or worked out in any detail, because he was unfortunately killed at 39, the same age that Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. It's a commonplace today to note that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were actually moving closer to each other towards the end of Malcolm X's life. Martin Luther King, who had pushed for integration and nonviolence, was in fact ramping up his own criticism of capitalism, and eventually became extremely tied to the criticism of imperialism, which Malcolm X had also found to be a fruitful area of thought during the end of his own life. And Malcolm X's move towards universal human rights and natural law made for some hope that the two of them might actually cross paths at some point, and maybe eventually put forward a unified front for the civil rights movement. In many ways, I think it's unfortunate that we never got to see exactly what would have come out of that. Of course, that's in part because of white supremacists killing Martin Luther King Jr. and because of members of the Nation of Islam killing Malcolm X. Okay, all of that said, let's tie Malcolm X into some of the themes for the class. So we're going to have to do this a little bit different because Malcolm X has his somewhat distinct early and later periods that I've talked about through the lecture, so I'm going to distinguish those as we go. So, human nature. Well, early on, he believed that blacks were naturally superior and whites were inferior, but had taken power over blacks, and he identified the two with different kind of moral positions. So blacks naturally were moral and upstanding, whereas whites, he believed, were in fact oppressive over other peoples. That was kind of their racial nature. Later, he changed the categories of his analysis to oppressor and oppressed, and he discarded his earlier racial separatism, even though the way that got worked out never got entirely finished in his thought. Social or individual? Well, he assumes that humans are naturally social, gaining their identities in relation to social categories, which include racial categories, but also religious categories. Early in his life, he assumes that this identity was ontological. It's a big fancy word, just meaning having to do with your essential nature. So having to do with the inherited nature of the person, specifically related to their race. Later, he accepted that this identity is not necessitated by nature, that people could in fact break away from the race that they were a part of. And he imagined those people who were whites who fought on behalf of racial equality as people who had done just this. People and property. He universally, really across his life, believed that blacks have been shorted of their equal rights to things including property, and this implies that there is a right to private property. Early on, he imagined that this could be solved by the creation of an alternative black-based capitalism, so a kind of separated community of blacks that would build their own capitalistic economy. Later, he comes to critique capitalism, but the critique is not developed enough to establish if this changed his view of property rights, or exactly what his view of property rights would have been had he been able to articulate it at the end of his life. Equality or inequality? Well, early on, he believed that blacks were naturally superior in their powers to whites. He imagined the creation of a separate black community which would exploit this superiority. But he doesn't seem to imagine a society in which there are like superior rights for blacks. He doesn't actually have any interest in reversing the hierarchy of white supremacy. He would rather establish separate and in some ways perhaps competing societies. Later, he accepts the potential equality of blacks and whites in their powers. It might be that white people can have moral powers similar to black people. But he continues to fault white society in America for shorting black people on their equal rights. The shape of government. Well, early on, his goal is the formation of a government by blacks for blacks. But at the same time, he seems to assume a kind of shape of government that overlaps with the kind of government he's familiar with in the United States. Basically, a liberal democracy just internal to one racial group. So people would have recognized rights in the society and be able to participate in politics, etc. Later on, his arguments seem to presuppose the legitimacy of a multiracial liberal democracy, but only if that democracy protects and provides for the rights of all of its citizens. And here he's especially concerned with blacks, but he also spoke out about women's rights. The purpose of government. Well, early on, he would have imagined that the purpose of government in that separate society would be to empower blacks who need to be brought out of their brainwashed states, which whites and white supremacy had brought them to. Later on, he seems to accept generally the description that had been typical of liberal society, that the purpose of government is to protect the rights of all of its citizens, and to accept the justification of violence and rebellion that had been internal to the liberal tradition. Basically, if the government doesn't function to protect those rights, then the populace is justified in rebelling. What authorizes leadership? Well, early on, religious and racial identity were the primary authorizing elements that Malcolm X recognized. This could be combined with the fight for black nationalism, but basically he accepted a kind of hierarchy internal to the Nation of Islam. But later he appears to broaden this out to suggest that leadership is authorized by participation in the effort to fight for the rights of the oppressed. Given his general affinity and assumption of liberal democratic structures of government behind his thought, one might be tempted to say that the vote of the people would in fact authorize leadership. But he's clear that he doesn't just want a formal democracy, one that has voting, but he wants a substantive democracy, one that actually stands up for the rights of all of its members. So regardless of whether the leadership is voted in, it turns out that they're only actually legitimate if they do the right thing. Okay, so in this lecture, we've continued the development of black political thought from Frederick Douglass on through a couple of the people that follow after him, and then developed the thought of Malcolm X. Malcolm is still in many ways at the beginning of the development of arguments about institutional justice and racial ideology that becomes central to contemporary positions in race and gender studies. But we'll continue to develop all of this by next time looking at bell hooks. So I look forward to seeing you then. We'll be back for the lecture on bell hooks.